Okay, welcome. Welcome to Generous Theology. It is a joy to be here. I am Brock, and I'm with my friend Chuck. And Chuck, we are here, and we are recording episode 100. Now, in a technical sense, I should say we're recording 101, but you and I decided to maybe try to celebrate this episode as our 100th anniversary as we went through Bavinck, for probably a couple of reasons. First of all, we really we had a vision for this channel when we started 100 episodes ago, building around the generous theology, as you and I have characterized it, of Herman Bavinck. And at the same time, we're at a very interesting point. We're reading through Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics. Now, that's a 4-volume set for those familiar with the work. And we are in a chapter 6 in volume 1 of Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, and the chapter is entitled Reformed Dogmatics. So we have a circular reference tied in with our 100th anniversary, and Bavinck gets to be the center of it all. So as we get into this chapter, my friend, maybe throw out to me what you're thinking when we're getting into Bavinck and the role that you hope he plays in giving us an informed picture, both of our doctrines as well as of our history.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. You mentioned doctrine and history both. And for the history part, I think there's a couple of different ways to approach it, all of which I think we can get out of Bavinck. One is that Bavinck has done a real historical overview and a review of what had come before him, and has done it in a way that is connected to the idea of Reformed dogmatics, to the idea of doing theology in a Reformed way, in the way of what are the Reformed views on various theological issues, and how do we tie those all together in a systematics? So he's doing that to looking back at history, and so we've talked about that in the last number of weeks. We spent some time last week looking at Lutheran dogmatics, and especially some of the history around the Reformation and what came later in at least European Lutheranism. Prior to that, we talked about Roman Catholic dogmatics and some of the history of scholasticism and what came after that. Prior to that, the formation of dogma East and West and some of the issues around that. And Bavinck has very carefully and with a lot of detail laid out a history, but all in a way of helping us to get to where he's going to be, going in these 4 volumes, of which we're only maybe a quarter or a third of the way through the first. The other historical piece, I think, is that it is very interesting to read Bavinck in his context. Obviously, Bavinck is a late 19th century to early 20th century writer. These chapters were written in the 19th century, late 19th century, not long after some key folks in theological history were extant, people like Schleiermacher and others. And so you have this sense in which he's looking back, but not from as great a distance, to some of these major changes that today we still think have had a major impact on the world of theology, on the world of philosophy. But also, Bavinck is writing before some of the changes that have come from neo-orthodoxy. And so in some ways, because of that, he provides somewhat of an alternative to neo-orthodoxy, the works and the ideas of people like Karl Barth. And I think because of that, and because he is writing in a world where that way of thinking has not yet really taken hold, we can do some separation, right? We can do some contrast and comparison with what did come. And in fact, as you and I have talked about, it would be interesting to think about what would have a world have been like where Herman Bavinck, perhaps instead of being in the Netherlands, which was a little outside the mainstream in theological thought, what if he had been in Germany? What if he had been more tied in, more accessible to that theological mainstream of the time? Would that have changed things? Well, we don't know, but we can certainly talk about it. The other thing that we can do then is, as we as we consider, again, as we consider his writings today, as we know, there are folks who differ a little bit on exactly where does Bavinck fall on some of these things. There are those who occasionally accuse Bavinck of being too tied into certain types of rationalistic thinking. Others who feel that no, he's still too tied to old traditional ways of thinking. And I think one of the neat things about Bavinck is because he's writing at a time before all of that has really coalesced, there is the opportunity, I think, to read him and understand him outside of some of those sort of those ways of thinking that have become standard today. I look forward to where he's going to go, and obviously I think as we finish, this is the last chapter in that section on history, and we move into the foundations of dogmatic theology. I think it's going to nicely set a place for us, so that as we consider these foundations and as we consider issues like revelation and other issues that faith and other concepts that Bavinck will bring up in the Reformed dogmatics, we're now going to have this historical context that we can always fall back on. And then as far as the dogmatics itself, I think it serves us well as well. There is a sense that we as Reformed Christians, we do have a lot from the Reformation era and the Scholastic era as far as thinking about Reformed dogmatics and thinking about Reformed theology. And Bavinck is something beyond that. He comes from a time after that, and I think there's a real value then also in the way that Bavinck does engage with his times, does engage with that modernistic liberal way of thinking. And I think, and we've talked about this a little bit, and I think as we move on, we'll see that Bavinck also, even though he wasn't aware of postmodernism, he wasn't aware of some of the directions that 21st century theological thought would move, because he is closer to that than, say, folks like John Calvin and others from that era, who are wonderful to read, would never want to give up on them. But because Bavinck's a little closer to them, I think it is a little easier then to apply him to some of our issues that we deal with today. In some ways, we'll see that Bavinck has almost predicted some things that have come. Other places, maybe not so much, but because he's engaged with that additional 2 centuries and a half of thinking, there's some real benefit to reading through Bavinck and seeing the direction that he goes. How about you? What as we get into this chapter and then looking back at 100 episodes of talking about both Bavinck and about others, and even time that we spent before we decided to start recording, we spent a good deal of time, just you and I, talking over a number of books and a number of issues in theology and philosophy. I wonder if there are some things that are especially exciting to you as we move into this section on Reformed dogmatics, and then as that leads us into some of the other chapters that will be coming up next, foundations of theology and such.
Chuck, thank you for asking. I would have to say this, and I mean it somewhat jokingly, but in part 1, we had an introduction to dogmatics, and that was an important part. The first 2 chapters that made that up, that you and I talked about in great detail, were very important for Bavinck to write, because in some sense, he has to answer the question, can we even have a dogmatics? After all, this is volume 1. Volume 1, this is prolegomena. Prolegomena means first things. And so we're talking about the preconditions under which dogmatics is possible. And in some sense, it's all about investigating foundations. Chuck, if you and I wished to build a building, it would do us no good to look at the interior decoration styles and choices at an early stage of our investigation. Much more important to the building's stability is its structure, is its foundation, is the type of materials being used to build the superstructure and then to build the ornamenting walls around that. And that's what we're doing here. So in some sense, people who've maybe been with us and we're thinking, wow, we're building the building of Bavinck. When do we get into the choices of styles? When do we get into the what kind of color palette is going to be used to paint the walls with? What kinds of drapes are going to hang in this building? What sorts of art is going to hang on the walls? Don't get me wrong, those are important things, and I'm not trying to minimize, but we've been looking at foundations. And Chuck, that's what I love to do. I love to be a foundation inspector. I think you and I have made this point repeatedly. You can have the best interior design in the world. You can have the best furniture inside of the building that you're building. You can house the highest status corporations. You can have the best clientele. But if the structure is not architecturally sound, then it reminds me of the story in the Bible. The foolish man built his house upon the sand, but the wise man built his house upon the rock. And so an important part of the inquiry into wise theology is building on a solid superstructure. And so all that to just say that this is where Bavinck shines for me. It's not that volumes 2, 3, and 4 aren't important, because they are. However, for me, Bavinck's volume 1 is the volume. I've spent around 10 years in this single volume, and it is still yielding delicious treasures to me. So, Chuck, I'm really pleased with that. We're really coming to the end of part 2, which is the history section. So part 1, Bavinck makes the case that there can and should be a science of Christian dogmatics, of Reformed dogmatics. Now, in part 2, he's given us the historical view and the literature form that the dogmatic studies are going to take. And so he talks about East and West in the early church. He talks about the Roman Catholic Church, Lutheran dogmatics you mentioned. Today, we're actually into the historical summary section of the Reformed movement, which grows out of the Protestant Reformation. Now, how can you summarize 500-ish years of history in one chapter? Well, Bavinck gives us his answer. The first section, he talks about Lutherans and Calvinists and some of the differences, some of the distinctives. And then he talks about the beginnings. And then he goes through and he talks about the period in time called the Reformed scholasticism. And then he talks about some of the challenges in this chapter to Reformed theology outside of the church superstructure as well as inside. And then, unfortunately, Chuck, this was heartbreaking. There's a section on the decline of Reformed theology. When you and I speak today, we, in some sense, have largely, as some people would measure it, we've largely backed a loser. There are very few historical, confessional, creedal Christians today. And there are even very significantly, as a percentage of the population, significantly fewer Christians today because of issues that we've explored, which is to say the challenges of modernity, ideas of rationalism, ideas of romanticism, ideas of idealism, and the trend toward the anti-dogmatic. And in some sense, Reformed theology is a bit like a prize fighter who has taken a lot of shots. And dare I even say it, Chuck, from certain points of view, we've gone down for the count, and there are lots of places where the fight's over, and there's something else there today. For example, does Calvin's Geneva exist? We value the institutes of the Christian religion, and we value the life work of John Calvin that he did in jump-starting this Southwest European Reformation movement. And yet, the areas where Calvin lived and worked and had his influence, where are they today? And why is that? Well, I think Bavinck's going to help us with this. And then we're going to see the 19th century streams, and then Bavinck's going to write a very interesting section on Reformed theology in North America, which I loved because you and I are sitting here looking back on this time period, and we get to evaluate and judge Bavinck on that. So that's my high-level overview and response there is that I'm rolling around in the good stuff. And as we finish up part 2, I think Bavinck has made his case. And now we've examined foundations in terms of asking a justifying question for why we should even go with Professor Bavinck on this journey. But now in part 3 and in part 4 and in part 5 of this volume, we're going to get into the heart of it. So part 3 is going to be the foundations of dogmatic theology. Part 4 is the principium of revelation. And then finally, in part 5, we have the principium, the foundation, the internal foundation, which is faith. So I'm really excited with this chapter and excited for where it's going. Now, with that in mind, Chuck, here in chapter 6, talking about Reformed dogmatics, the first section is on Lutheran and Calvinists, and we just talked about Lutherans in the previous chapter, and now we're doing this survey of the Calvinists, and the differences was very interesting and somewhat, I'm not sure if I'm going to say this right, help me perhaps. There's a political component to the actual history of how the Reformation occurs in the public spaces of Western Europe and Northern Europe, and there is a populist element that's happening in the Protestant Reformation here, and ideas are being bandied about. What do you think about that intellectual period that the Reformation gets started in, and how would it compare maybe in your thinking to our time period today?
Well, it certainly was a very interesting time, and you're right that certainly geopolitical issues ended up playing a large role in how things turned out, both with the details of the Reformation, what areas ended up being more Reformed, what areas ended up being more Lutheran, and what came out of those areas. And even prior to that, what areas remained Catholic, which areas were part of the Protestant Reformation, and where there were some battles. And so it is really interesting that even today, because of that geopolitical influence, we use geographic markers to describe different types of thinking. And for example, I belong to a tradition that is called Dutch Reformed. Now, it's true that many of the thinkers from that Dutch Reformed tradition are from the Netherlands. Many of them are Dutch immigrants to places like the United States and Canada and Australia. But certainly, to use the term Dutch Reformed often makes people assume that we're only talking about a very narrow group of folks, and rather the Dutch Reformed tradition is somewhat broader than that. There are plenty of people, including myself, in the Dutch Reformed tradition who don't have a drop of Dutch ancestry, but we use that terminology. We'll often talk about Huguenot tradition, which is the French Protestants who were, many of whom ended up in North America, many of whom ended up in the Netherlands because of geopolitical issues and what happened in France with basically the political decision to not go along with the Reformation after a period of time where the French Reformation was quite strong. You've got issues around the Anglican communion, and Anglican, of course, has that word Anglican because they're talking about England and the English Reformation, and the English Reformation is perhaps par excellence the example of geopolitical issues becoming involved. Henry VIII certainly playing a large role in the English Reformation for reasons that have very little to do with theology and have much more to do with merely his unwillingness to be secondary to certain Catholic and continental European leaders. So it is really interesting that we have those kinds of issues going on. I think one that sometimes those in the Dutch Reformed tradition are not always as aware of is even just the provenance of some of our confessions. The Heidelberg Catechism, which is that there are the three forms of unity of the Continental Reformed and the Westminster Confession of the Scottish and English Presbyterian tradition don't have a lot of disagreement, certainly, but there are some differences in style and some differences in content, what is covered and what is not covered, that have certainly made for some small but important differences between that Dutch Reformed and that Presbyterian tradition. And some of that comes from the history of those confessions. The Heidelberg Catechism was written by certainly Reformed thinkers, early Reformed thinkers, but was published in an area where there was some back and forth between Lutheran and Reformed rulers, and where in fact you had an attempt to bring together Lutherans and Reforms in a single political entity. And for example, I found that sometimes when dealing with Lutheran Christians, using the Heidelberg Catechism, it just allows for language that to some extent is less foreign to Lutheran ways of thinking. And sometimes going with the Heidelberg Catechism is a good way of engaging Lutheran thinkers with some of the ideas of the Calvinist Reformation. So it's really super interesting, and we'll get into this even more later in the chapter where we're going to deal with, as you pointed out, where does Reformed theology go in Europe? What happens in North America? Even some differences within North America because of the geopolitical issues that were going on earlier in Europe. And so it seems to me that in some ways really fully understand, and I mean that what I say, to fully understand, not necessarily just to understand it, but to fully understand some of the nuances here. You almost have to be a historian. You have to be a little bit of a politician. You have to know a lot about a lot of different things to get into this. And what I love is that Bavinck is able to cover a lot of that in a way that brings it to us and makes some of those things clear. That's something I really appreciated.
Chuck, I really like that. We talked about the distinctions between Lutherans and Calvinists, and there's a way in which we can maximize those, but there's also a way in which we can minimize them. So if we focus on the differences, it can look like we are extremely distinct, and yet we probably share, and I haven't done an actual measurement, so I don't know what the percentage might be, but I would just suppose maybe 95% or so of the same doctrine. So in some sense, close kin, especially when you might contrast us with many other religious movements, and especially with non-religious or secular movements. We're very close. Now, we've talked a little bit about how things got started. Of course, Luther is the shot, is the singular person who embodies this Protestant reforming break. Within Luther's lifetime, we have the emergence of what we can call a first generation of reformers. And within a very quick time, and when I say quick time, I mean by the second generation of people who are involved in the Protestant Reformation, we already see these formative ideas being put into a code. And so one of the things that started to happen fairly early, maybe even in this first and second generation, you have on the Lutheran side, you have the systematician, Philip Melanchthon, for the Lutherans. And then on the Reformed side, the Calvinist side, we have John Calvin. And so those two persons, of course, many others are involved. It always surprises people, I think, to find out just how many thinkers there were and how engaged they were at this time. And yet we trace it through that. And then when you move through those first and second generations, you come to this high period, this classic period of creeds and confessions. Perhaps one of the most important movements that came out among this is this idea of a reformed scholasticism. And Chuck, I would love your thoughts on and reaction to this idea of reformed scholasticism. And let me think if I can throw out some terms, maybe reformed 2.0. Whatever reformed scholasticism is, it is in stark contrast with much of the first generation or two of reformers. And yet there's a continuity there. We historically minded folks always have to throw that in there. But saying that, what's going on in your mind with the Reformed scholastic movement and how it fits with the part of Reformed theology that's not scholastic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for it, other than to describe it, first of all, in relation to the scholasticism that we see in other traditions. We've talked about Lutheran scholasticism, we've talked about Roman Catholic scholasticism, and certainly there does seem to be a pattern, right? That after a Reformation, a time of thinking through things, perhaps in a more, I don't know, simple is maybe not the right word, but in a more practical way, because often history requires that, then as one consolidates, as one thinks about what they're thinking, there's really a need to think more deeply about our theology. There's a need to think more deeply about what is it we believe. And so there's always this tendency then to move from mere theology to a study of theology as it's impacted by philosophy. Certainly in Roman Catholic scholasticism in the Middle Ages, we see that it becomes especially strong when the writings of Aristotle become rediscovered in Europe, and challenge of Aristotle and the study of Aristotle and the comparisons with Plato as people are studying that, they're applying that thinking to their theology. Lutheran scholasticism, which I knew very little bit about, and what little I do know is to some extent the result of this chapter that we just previously read from Bavinck on Lutheran dogmatics, is something similar. Although in the case of at least European Lutheranism, that scholasticism really becomes the triumph of philosophy, as it's called in Bavinck's chapter, and perhaps even in some ways the German schools of theology that move away from very traditional ways of thinking about who God is and who humans are. And so now in the Reformed world as well, after an initial period of just simply spending time doing some apologetics, doing some sort of consolidation of what is it that we actually believe, dealing with some of the first debates in the Reformed world, there is this sense in which now we move into a period of engaging in some ways with the world, but also it can turn into also bringing the world into our theology. Now, certainly not all Reformed scholastics are guilty of bowing to the idols of their times, bowing to the philosophical winds of change, but there is certainly a sense in which the Reformed scholastics were very much thinking about issues beyond theology per se, and also then thinking about many of the issues that we've been talking about. What does it mean for there to be a creator and a creature? What is a human being? How do we think? How do we perceive? How do we know what we know? How do we know that we know what we know? Those kinds of questions many of the Reformed scholastics asked. And I'm aware, and we've talked a little bit about this, I think, that some of our confessional Lutheran friends, especially in North America, are concerned that Reformed scholastics went too far, and in the same way that the scholastics in European Lutheranism did. And so there is often this challenge to Reformed folks from Lutherans that say, look, you're going far beyond merely what the Bible presents. You're trying to dive into the mysterious things of God, and you shouldn't do that. Stop. And we Reformed people would say no. That certainly we value there being some things that are unknowable. We know that God in and of himself is beyond us. How could we mere humans, mere creatures, deign to know everything of God and of his plan and of his will? But we see value in diving into those things as a way of knowing more about God and knowing more about his creation. Is there some danger in that thinking? Is there some danger that at least some, and Bavinck seems to make this case that while there were great Orthodox Reformed scholastics in the 17th century and maybe even into the early 18th century perhaps, but he also points out that already by the 17th century, the principles were present that undermined Reformed theology and brought about its decline. In the century of the Reformation, there was not only a Lutheran and a Calvinist version of it, but others. There were humanists who opposed the church there. And he goes into a whole section of some of the challenges of especially rationalism and mysticism. And he seems to make some connection between some of the excesses, shall we say, of Reformed scholasticism and that decline that comes around 1850. Now, I think we need to be careful in that while he does seem to draw a line there, I don't know that he's drawing it as a causal line. Bavinck is not saying that merely the fact that Reformed scholastics dived into these things led to the decline of Reformed theology. Rather, I think what he's saying is that as we dive into these new things, we have to be aware that we're going to be, when we go beyond simply the plain word of God and start diving into how do we know more things, there is a tendency for us to be impacted by the worldviews around us and to sometimes swallow those worldviews, maybe whole, or at least maybe portions of them, without really understanding that we've done that. And as Bavinck talks about some of the decline in the 18th century and then some of the 19th century streams that parallel some of the things that happened in Lutheranism and Catholicism, but also some areas where there were some differences. I think Bavinck is, rather than talking about a cause and effect, rather he's talking about he's describing things that happened and pointing out where good has come out of it and where not so good has necessarily come out of it. What do you think? I think that's perhaps just one particular way of looking at Reformed scholasticism and Bavinck's view of it. I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Thank you, Chuck. I do have thoughts about it, and most of them are critical in the generous sense. So Bavinck here talks about two pillars within Reformed theology, one that he calls a biblical theology, and he associates it with Calvin, and he puts it as a part of Reformed theology that parallels the scholasticism of Reformed theology. Now, in contrast to that theology of Calvin, and I think we can ultimately say of the Dutch reformers, of whom Bavinck is a great example, I think we see more continental thinkers who tended to want to stick with a continuity that's associated with the thought of the Middle Ages. And so we start off early in Reformed theology with scholastic theologians such as Junius Zanchius, Paulinus. Bavinck also mentions Gilbert Voetius. And I think we see that these two pillars develop in very interesting and different ways. When I look at the continuity, I think I see continuity much more developed in the scholastic side of Reformed theology. One aspect of scholastic theology is this primacy of the Latin culture and the Latin writings of the early Reformation. We in the English-speaking world who are Calvinists are perhaps used to the schools of Calvinism that came out of Calvin's biblical theology, that came out of the Dutch Reformed, and that came out of the hot mess that it was Calvinist theology in Great Britain, in England. And so the continental scholastic forms tend to be a little bit more foreign to us, but in many ways, there seems to be much more continuity there, much more continuity with the other major forces within Christendom. So the scholasticism of Reformed theology, at least in some principle, values a continuity with the Roman Catholic scholasticism that came about in the High Middle Ages. I'm trying really hard to say that this doesn't make our Reformed scholastics just Roman Catholics in disguise, far from it. But to say that they valued that tradition, they valued this classical tradition that came through the High Middle Ages and was represented in the theology of Thomas Aquinas, who was himself greatly esteemed, Aristotle and Aristotelian categories and ideas of thought. And that approach captured large portions of the continent in the early parts of Reformed theology's formation. Now, all this to say this, the scholastics seem to have held things together in terms of continuity much more than the biblical theology wing. And we can see that in other schools of thought that Calvin brings up. So Calvin talks about the French Academy at Saumur and the English Puritans, who we've mentioned, as well as even the growth of Baptist groups. And so you have much more diversity in that side of the fence. Now, as to which side is the right side or the true side or the correct orthodoxy. Of course, I've spent my life training from the biblical theology side, but I have to say I'm impressed with much in the scholastic side of things, even if I might not go so far as to identify with it. Now, interestingly enough, it is out of the scholastic movement and influence that the classic creeds and confessions are written in the 17th century. So think of the Westminster Confession of Faith time period in the English world. Think of the London Baptist Confession of Faith, also from there. But think also of the three forms of unity, the canons of Dort, the Helvetic Consensus, so many other different, I'm trying to think of the right word, service level agreements. Calvinists in this phrase really thought it was a virtue to put things in writing and in summary form, almost like a legal code. Now, Chuck, this was a beautiful segue for me, because in your legal training, I know that you value the fact that a legal code has to be a written code. It has to be a code that develops through a legislative process. And while it's not exactly the same process that goes into drafting confessional standards, still there's some degree of interaction and diligence and process in producing these confessional standards. How do you value those in your own thinking? What are the pros and cons of that confessional approach, and what do you think about their impact on the society that even affects us to this day?
Yeah, one of the interesting things, the parallel with legal codes is really, I think, a good one and very interesting, because I think it perhaps encapsulates some of both the benefits and the good things that come from Reformed scholasticism and that way of thinking, as well as some of the potential dangers that can come from it. A legal code puts some boundaries, right? It tells you where you can go and where you can't go. It describes things in ways that put things in black and white. It takes difficult concepts and adds definition to them and applies them in the world. And a legal code is also rather comprehensive, or at least a good one is. It covers a lot of areas of life. So even as I this past year, I spent some time, we're doing a recodification of our city ordinances. And one of the things we did in our recodification was think about some of our codes and some of our ordinances that were not part of our municipal code, and trying to bring those in. And there's so much that we cover. We've got a zoning code. We've got shoreland and wetland preservation codes. We've got codes that deal with traffic and highway issues. We've got codes that deal with protecting the community from negative behavior. We've got noise ordinances. We've got there's all sorts of things that end up getting covered in a legal code, and it gets even larger when you talk about statewide and federal legal codes as well. And one of the neat things about Reformed scholasticism is that it also covers a lot. There's so much that can be studied in the light of Scripture. There's so much that we can apply our knowledge of doctrine and dogmatics to, that you can have all sorts of materials to study and to work with. The negative thing is sometimes with a legal code, people get so tied to the legal code itself that the principles behind the code can get lost. There is this idea of, well, shouldn't we follow the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law? And then how do you do that? One of the problems is that when I was prosecuting, I had all sorts of people come to me, tell me that they might have broken the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. And then they were trying to persuade me why their spirit of the law is the correct spirit of the law to consider. And of course, that it's hard for written codes to deal with that. And so the way we deal with that with a legal code is by making it amendable. And so as things change, as policies may change, you can amend that code. But there do come times where sometimes people are they don't understand that perhaps, or they get so tied in to particular things in codes that there's not necessarily even an ability to get out of, to think outside of the box and think about new ways of crafting legal codes that will implement the policies of those making policies. Similarly, I think there is a tendency in Reformed scholasticism, there can be a tendency, and certainly not everyone does this, but to get so tied up into a lot of the details, a lot of the black and whites of it, that we forget that our study of scholastic theology isn't something that should be done in and for itself, but is done as a way of improving our ability, A, to understand God, but then also to impart that understanding in a pastoral way to people. And so there always needs to be a connection between scholastic theology and pastoral work. And it can be, I think sometimes there is a tendency to forget that connection. Now, I was reading a little bit on Reformed scholasticism and some criticisms, as well as some positive things that come from it. And I know I have a couple of cousins who are pastors who went to conservative Reformed seminaries where the Reformed scholastics were actually quite important and were considered very much key to their theological education. But what I appreciate, especially, I have a cousin he's now a pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He went to seminary at Westminster Seminary out west in California, what we often call Westminster West. And I have often been impressed with how, on the one hand, he has this real deep knowledge and great interest in a lot of folks like Turretin and other Reformed scholastics, but he's able to apply it in a way that is pastoral. And he's part of a small congregation that is doing a lot of really good work in outreach and evangelism, church planting, that kind of thing. And going into some of the most detailed issues of Francis Turretin's theology, what is it? I think his book is called Principles of Elenctic Theology, something like that. It's good to know that stuff, but if your sermons are just spitting that out, you're probably not going to do a real good job of drawing your typical suburban Twin Cities. He's on the Wisconsin side of the border, or your local farmer from some rural county in northern Wisconsin to come to your church. But if you apply those things in a way that's very pastoral, it can be amazing. It can really get at key issues in people's lives. And so I think what we need to always be thinking about as we study Reformed scholasticism is just that let's study it. Let's get into some of the deep waters that they go into, but let's always be careful to maintain the connection between scholastic theology and everyday pastoral work. And I think if we do that, then there's a great deal that we can get out of this. And so I would say that Bavinck doesn't dive too deeply into the specific history of the church in the Netherlands. He does a little bit of that, but I think we actually see some of that in the history of the 19th century Dutch Reformed Church, where that decline in Reformed theology has taken hold by the mid-18th century. The state church of the Netherlands becomes rather moribund and isn't really doing much of anything, perhaps losing some of its salt, shall we say. And the first reaction to that was a pietist reaction, similar to what we'd seen in some Lutheran parts of Europe. You have in the Netherlands what's called the afscheiding, the separation, where people had separated from the state church because of their concerns about the liberalism of the state Dutch Reformed Church, and would meet together in these little conventicles where they would just gather to read scripture and apply it to their lives in a very simple way. And then you start with that in the early to mid part of the 19th century, and then later, as a result of the Reveil and other issues that are going on in and around Europe, you have the later movement of folks like Abraham Kuyper and a more educated group of pastors and thinkers who recognize that while they don't want to lose the benefits of that scholastic thinking, that they still need to do this pastoral work with the kleine Leuten, that the little people, as Kuyper often referred to them, and we've referred to that as well in our discussions. And Bavinck himself is a mixture of both of those traditions. His family came from both of those traditions. He certainly ended up in a university setting, in a theological faculty, but he himself had been a pastor of one of these separatist Afscheiding congregations, and so I think again what is so magical about Bavinck is he too is able to bring these things together. He can gather the knowledge that results from these Reformed scholastics, but he also can then apply it in a very pastoral way, both to his students who are studying to be theologians and philosophers, and many of them pastors as well, but also applying it in a way that's going to be helpful to the fisherman in Gelderland, or the farmer in the Bible Belt in central Netherlands, or to the dock worker in Rotterdam, or whoever. There's a need to connect all of that to everyday life, and Bavinck, I think, is an example of doing that as well.